So next week we don't have school because of spring break. I don't know if things are open on campus normally. Um, I will try not to be here for some days, but I might have to pop in for things. But if you have questions, you can also send me a message. I think I told my other classes. So if you're looking to certify for Security Plus, if you've taken CS-27 or Network Plus, if you've taken 40A with me, or 25, which is A plus. Make sure you email me. I have some vouchers that will expire at the end of May. And if you like to use that, you can just contact me via email and I'll send it to you. So we're trying to clean up that and then we'll try to get some extensions. So make sure you sit for the certification because we don't know if we're going to get additional funding to buy that. We're going to try to do that, but okay. All right. So in this week, we're going to talk about security appliance, particularly the firewall and some of the systems that you use for protection. And then as a pen tester, you likely will have to get through some of these systems in order to get into different segment of the network. So we'll start with intrusion detection system. So these systems are alarm systems. Basically, it's gonna give you notification when there's an intrusion, an unauthorized access to different parts of your network or systems. And these typically look at activities from a network standpoint. So it's looking at traffic that is being passed into the network. So in order to connect to your network, they have to, access, right? Typically, we would have a firewall or some kind of prevention system at the entrance of your network before it hits the router. So your network monitoring programs or the appliance itself, it's going to identify the activities on the network and it's going to report. Now you have intrusion detection system that is really focused on the network itself, or you can have an alarm system for specific critical servers and so on. So typically you are going to see a lot of the NIDS, which is Network Intrusion Detection System, and it is going to be just reacting to activities that are jeopardizing your network, right? It doesn't prevent, it's just sounding off the alarm when there's anomalies or suspicious activity. So with that, we can answer the first question. It asks you to describe the function and the objectives of intrusion detection system. And intrusion detection system, your IDS, it basically monitors the activities on the system or the network, right? If you have a network intrusion detection system, it's going to look at your network traffic and it's going to generate alerts or notification alarm to let you know that there is an intrusion. There's anomalies in network activity or system activity. So if someone is logging onto the system or trying to access the system unauthorized, right? What you would see is it's going to give you the notification. Either typically it's like a message in email, right? Or if you tie that back into the security management system, it's going to then provide that information to the centralized management system. So it really ensure, right? It's looking at confidentiality, which relates to, information that we want to protect, integrity to make sure that your data is not jeopardized. And typically that's on certain system or storage. And then availability of the network in the case that if they're gonna potentially attack, right? Take down certain server. We'll talk about denial of service attack in the past. So we use intrusion detection system is to reacting to potential entry that is unauthorized. Okay. Now, network base, you would typically have that, and normally we have that on the internal network. to detect any kind of activities that's jeopardizing our network. So you might have multiple IDS systems that are connected to different areas, especially in the critical segment of your network. So if I have like sets of servers that are providing services to my private network, you typically would have that segment connected to the intrusion detection system. So it's an appliance. It looks similar to what you see with a lot of the network appliance. What it does is it screens, right, all the activities on that network. And you can set rules for it to look for specific anomalies, right? By default, that's what it does, but we would configure it to monitor the activities. So let's say that if someone is trying to attack your server, right? And they are launching the denial of service attack, it's going to take a look at the type of packets that are coming in, and we talked about like how it could be coming from multiple IP addresses if it's DDoS, or it could be a set of active packets that's coming from one IP address, right? And it's going to sound off the alarm. Unlike the prevention system, the intrusion detection system only going to notify you, right? It doesn't really block the activity. It's only going to let you know that it's happening. So the question two would ask you, how do network-based IDS detect suspicious activity on the network? How do host-based IDS detect malicious activities on the network? So the network-based IDS, it looks at the header and the payload of the packets. Remember that packets contain labels, right? Where that's coming from and where is it gonna go to, which destination. So the header of the packet really tells you who's sending and who's receiving, which system is sending and which system is receiving. So if the attacker is launching the attack from the outside of the network coming in, you would see that it's going to show, right, the IP address, the public IP address of that particular system that they're using. Even if they mask or spoof the IP, it's still going to put that onto the header. The payload is going to contain your data content. So in the case that it's launching requests, right? We saw some of the technique where DDoS or DOS, it typically just in fire, right, continuously on, for information, for the system. It required response. So some of that is coming in with your payload. And so it's going to tell you the information of the protocol, right? That's part of the header. And then the payload is going to be your raw data. So the packet information would provide the intrusion detection system the details in that anomaly, that activity. And so based on the known attack patterns, so these appliances come with patterns and behaviors that's built in. So it's programmed into the system, right? And you can also configure it to identify what is an anomaly, right? So the rules that you set for it and the patterns that's equipped with it is going to help you determine, right, whether it is malicious activity or not. So if it sees that as a malicious activity, it's then going to set off a notification. A message is going to be either broadcast across certain part of the network that's being managed, right? Or the centralized management system. So in network appliances, what you see is you typically would have routers. Those are the appliances that's bringing the traffic into your network. That's like the freeway, right? And the switches are going to be bringing the traffic to specific area of your network. So for example, I might have, all the critical servers, right, tied to a switch. and that switch is going to bring the traffic from the router is going to take it to the network, and then from there, the switch is going to pick it up, and it's going to send it to the segment and the system. And then you would have the servers that's receiving inquiry and responding depending on its role, right? Whether it's authentication, we talked about that before, or web servers and so on. So even on the DMZ side, which is mostly available to the public, we're still gonna have to have security appliances to inform us whether attacks are happening. And then the firewalls. So firewalls, its job is to screen the traffic. It's like the security guard in front of the store, right? Looking at, who's coming in and who's leaving, and then preventing someone that could maliciously damage the property, right? So firewall screens the traffic and it does block, right? Also depending on the type of firewall. So there's activities that you see with the security appliance. Now, the host-based intrusion detection system, it is specifically used for that system. It is installed, right, on that system. So I might have servers that have HIDS, and normally you see that it is an application, right? And so what it does is it analyzes the activity based on the logs. Your system records all the events, right? So let's say that I have an authentication system that has HIDS. And in the case that someone is trying to brute force an account, or someone is trying to access that system in an unauthorized way, or have escalation of privilege, or accessing files where they're not supposed to, when they're not permitted to. So the user activities, the files that's being accessed is recorded onto the logs. And the host-based IDS look at that logs and tells you, right, whether that activity is malicious or not. So it is different than your network intrusion detection system in that the HIDS only look at system activity, whereas the network intrusion detection system, it's looking at network traffic and determine whether it is an intrusion or not, right? So know the difference. I know that some of you are studying for Security Plus, right? It's gonna ask you similar questions to this. Any question regarding IDS? All right. So the benefits of network intrusion detection system in that we use it to really look at what could be happening inside. We talked about insider threats, right? You might have somebody that's been planted inside the network, or they're filtering out information. Sometimes people can be bought, right? Fraudulent activity can happen. The benefits of using network intrusion detection is not just to detect that attacks that's coming in, but a lot of times the attacker, they properly plan their attack techniques, right? So if they bypass the firewall and they got into your network, hopefully, right, if our rules that we set on the network is effective, we should be able to detect that, right? So it's like an additional layer that you see for defensive approach. Now, in security, we say that it's really like reacting, right? It's already too late when you are being accessed at that level. But in security, what we do with the measure is that we want to have an additional layer of detection and prevention, right? So typically you would want to see if there is potential attack on the inside, like somebody that on the inside, or if they have bypassed some of your security measure that is protecting on the boundaries. So you would see that you would have like firewall and then IPS, the main difference in that is that it actually prevents. So it's going to drop that activity, whereas IDS, it just notifies you. So the drawback for this is that if they're using encrypted traffic, so if they're using VPNs to come in, right, and if they have bypassed your firewall, the NIDS, the network intrusion detection system, will not see So my analogy for this is like, let's say that someone is wearing a mask and, maybe a costume and they're entering your home. You won't be able to see who they actually are, right? So encryption protects their traffic, right? As we would use encryption to protect our own traffic, the attacker can do the same. So what you see is that in the NIDS, even if they actually crossing into your network, if they use encrypted traffic, if they're tunneling into your network, it becomes a trusted environment where it doesn't identify that traffic as an anomaly. So, we use appliances to give us more information about our activity, but at the same time, it's very limited in some sense, right? So that's the drawback. Any question regarding NIDS? Okay, let me move this up a little bit to answer 4. So compare that to your host-based intrusion detection system. The drawback for the HIDS is that your HIDS would give you host information only, right? Activities that's happening on that server as it's being attacked. And for us, when we look at that from a security perspective, like I said, right, once the threat is already detected, it's kind of late, but we're responding to it. So it's only monitoring that system and that system alone, right? So if you have that installed on your servers, right, like let's say your file server or different types of server, it's only looking at that server. And also the resources that it consumes, because any kind of monitoring tools that you have, it utilizes your processing and your RAM. So the accommodation for that, because it is an application that is installed on that system or a feature, right? Sometimes you would have that with software. You would need to make sure that your resources are abundant and available. Now, when you utilize all the resources, what will happen is that you won't be able to have an effective response, right? It might not be detected. So just like your antivirus and a lot of, security type of application, what you see is that it's only going to use the known signature, right? The known activities, the pattern, the things that it is equipped with or configured. So outside of that, now I think we are doing a little bit better also with like AI agents to kind of see that anything outside of our normal scope is considered irregular. So you do have some false positive and false negative in some of these security appliances. And knowing that, right, can someone enter the network and not be detected? For sure, yes. And this is what you see with attacks every day, right? If they're using encrypted traffic, if they're able to mask a lot of the information, it will not be able to identify who that is, what they're doing, and so on. So there's always a way to bypass, but keep in mind that like our security appliance is going to do its job and it's going to reach a limit. So that's how we would know. Question? Okay, in certification, typically you will have scenario-based questions as well. So you have to be familiar with like the type of security measures, the type of attacks, and how that is correlated with real-world scenarios or scenarios that they give you. So given the following scenarios, we have to identify the type of IDS that we would use for detection. So if the attacker performs distributed denial of service attack that's coming from many sources, right? And they're flooding your network with large volume, the system that is best suited to detect this is your network intrusion detection system. And we talked about that last time, right? If you see a lot of like the packets that are coming in from multiple sources targeting that one specific server, your NIDS should sound off some kind of alarm or notification saying that someone, right? Or which these are the systems that are targeting this specific server. Now it doesn't block it, right? It's just going to notify you. So that's the job of your network intrusion detection system. B, an unauthorized user gains access to the application server of the company and exploits its vulnerability. This is going to be best using HIDS to detect this type of activity. It is specifically for that server, right? And when they're accessing that server to gain some kind of access or elevate their access, that means that the host intrusion detection system that's installed on that particular server should sound off some kind of alarm. And then C, an attacker gains access to enterprise network by bypassing the firewall and compromises the authentication server to escalate the privileges. So you can use multiple systems. Just keep in mind that resources are going to be required, and also, right, also that you will likely have false positive in the sense that it might screen a lot and it might notify you something that might not even be happening too, right? So sometimes when we use a lot of like security appliance, it's good, but at the same time, the side effects is that sometimes it would be over alarming. Okay. So network intrusion detection system, that's going to address the network bypassing here, right? If they bypass the firewall and they got into your network, the NIDS should sound off. And then if they are looking to target the authentication server, if we have the HIDS installed here, that should pick it up, right? Now, if they're able to bypass NIDS, hopefully your HIDS would notify you. So the whole point in using multiple systems like this is just to get an additional security measure. Is it fail-proof? Not necessarily, right? But we are just buying time for sure. Okay. Any question? I will move 4 down. I think some of you are working on that so we can see the rest of 5. And then lastly, for D, a disgruntled employee attempts to delete critical company files and corrupt financial system, right? So files based, these are objects in the system, right? And when we're looking at financial systems, so if we have host-based intrusion detection system on the financial system, right, on the server that provides files for the company or on the computer that does that, then it will be host-based intrusion detection system. So this is a way that we can have notification in the case that our objects and our systems are being jeopardized. So how can they evade the IDS, right? There are several ways, and as a pen tester, you have to know how this is happening because you will likely having to approach it with the same technique to see if your system is prone to vulnerabilities or if it's misconfigured and so on. So the methods that's used by the attacker to evade the alarm system, your IDS, sometimes they would use fragmentation. This is a technique that they split up the payload into smaller pieces because if you see a bulk payload, a lot of the time the IDS will see that as an anomaly. So to bypass it, they will size the payload down to chunks. And the chunks is not going to flag the alarm system. It's not going to match the pattern or the rules that are set in the IDS. So that way they can bypass it, and the activity, the traffic that's coming in is going to go undetected. So when the IDS look at that packet size, right, and its payload, the content of it, it's going to see that it's not an anomaly. So that's how they can bypass it, is with fragmentation. Another technique that they would use is protocol level evasion. This is a way to exploit protocols that's in the TCP IP suite. And it is also manipulating your packet headers. Remember that the header is like the label on your package, right? It tells the system the source and the destination, and also the protocols, which is tied to the service for that network activity. So the packet headers contain protocol information, and if they modify it, right, it will not consider a malicious activity. So there are tools that they can use to be able to modify, like stuff a packet, change packet information if they capture that. So in order to do this attack, they have to sniff out your network activity, right? And be able to intercept that packet information and modify the header. So that's a way that they can bypass the IDS. So, you know, for the protocol traffic, protocol is really tied to like what kind of services that you're using on your network. And protocols were created a long time ago, so typically you would see weaknesses in these protocols. Another technique that they would use is obfuscation. Obfuscation is a way to modify, right, the content structure. And similar to what you see with fragmentation, but fragmentation is how they chunk it down to the smaller size. Where obfuscation is that they might encrypt the payload so that way the system cannot analyze the content that is in the packet. They also can use encoding techniques to be able to not, right, be identified by the IDS. The IDS itself is just to identify like which packet is not normal. Okay. So if they modify the content, which is the payload, then they would be able to bypass the IDS. Whereas fragmentation is they chunk it down to the smaller size. And based on that, the size doesn't match our anomaly rules. So it's also going to bypass. So this is like packet modification technique overall. Any question regarding bypassing IDS? So for our quiz, right, and our final exam, make sure you know the difference in network intrusion detection system, host-based intrusion detection system, also the techniques that are used to perform bypassing your security system, like IDS. And then we carry this into practice. So if you're studying for pen test plus or ethical hacking, you have to know these techniques that are being used. Okay. So with that, number 7, so it asks you, how can an attacker evade signature-based and behavior-based IDS? So signature is typically programmed or set in the system to say that this is the type of anomaly that we're seeing, right? And the behavior is the activities, trends, and the activities that you see that would consider an anomaly. So if they use encryption, right, of their scripts or code, or if they change that code structure or they inject it into legitimate files or programs, they can also pack your applications or your code or compress it so that way it doesn't match the signature. So typically the signature will really entail like this is considered malicious, right? This code is considered malicious. This script is considered malicious. And so if the IDS needs to identify that, it's going to compare the the code or the script that they use to the set signature on the system. But if they encrypt it, the IDS cannot read it, right? If they change the structure of it, it doesn't have a match. If they add it into a file that is legitimately allowed by the IDS, or I'm sorry, identify as an okay file, right? Not an anomaly file or an okay application, right? It's gonna then bypass. So these are some of the techniques that they use to bypass signature-based detection. So a signature is just like script structure, right? Script or code information. So on the system, if you buy that and install it, right, it would have a setup signature, and then you can update it over time. The vendor would allow you to push updates. You can also configure or add in, customize your IDS, which a lot of the engineers are doing. So if you work as a security engineer, typically you manage, right, firewall, IDS, appliances, and you have to keep up with the type of pattern, the attacks, things like that that's happening outside of what the vendor has provided. Let me see if I can. So if you're looking at not signature, right, like behavior. So behavior is just activities. So based on that, the system is set to be like, oh, this is an outlier if it is this type of pattern, possibly also in the logs itself. And so if it doesn't match it, then it can. So if they have like if they use encryption, if they change the nature of the activity, a lot of the times it goes undetected. So this is the challenge that we're working with. If you're looking at like blue team or defensive side, is that, you know, the engineers, they always have to adapt to the type of activity. And now, like if you see generative AI change the attack structure for sure. So when we're looking at that, we have to kind of see like, oh, if they're not using, right, these type of tools, they're using something else. The packets are a little bit different. So you do see like new ways and new things with generative AI for sure. Okay, let's take 8 up. So how can an attacker manipulate traffic to evade the IDS, right? We talked about fragmentation. They would chunk up like the packets or encrypt the packets. They can alter packet headers. They can spoof the source and the destination IP addresses, because typically our alarm system would have like, if it's sending from this IP address, sound off, right? If it's sending to this IP address, sound off. Well, network traffic has to go from somewhere, right? It has to send from a source and it has to go to a destination. Now, an attacker needs to receive the information back, right? They can send, but they also need to receive so that way they can perform, right, different types of attack. So the addresses can be masked or changed to be not identified. And then looking at the protocols that is used on the network and use permitted protocols. So now, like I said, right, a lot of the attack, in order to accomplish that attack, they have to sniff out your network activity to really see what you're using, which systems are communicating, what kind of services and protocols that you have. And then based on that, they would know the type of protocols that you use. So with that, they would incorporate that into their attack traffic. And then they can also redirect the traffic. So we set up routes to, to get the traffic to our network, right? And to get our traffic from our network to the next network. So they can change the way that the traffic is being sent across. That can be done with like proxy, reverse proxy. You can also, they can have ways to redirect. It depends on the traffic, like DNS can be redirected. So if they do DNS poisoning, that's typically just changing the records of your DNS. And if you don't protect your records of your DNS, right, that can be routed to their servers or other servers that's outside of your scope. So what you see is these are some of the things that they can perform. Now, DNS redirection is typically used with like phishing attacks. It can be used with like malware attacks. It can be used with authentication attacks and things like that, right? So what you see is that if your system is not able to see that it is a different path, right, to your essential systems or your resources, right, then it's not going to be able to sound off the alarm, notify you. Okay, any question regarding IDS? I spent a little bit more time because when I taught CIS-27, it touches on IDS and IPS, right? But Security Plus, it talks about like what it is and what it does. But when you get into pen testing and also network defense, you kind of really have to understand like what potentially can go wrong, what would be like the bypass, so that way you know how to be able to implement the countermeasure for it. Okay, so we can reference, right? IDS has a big section, IDS evasion. We talked about these things. And then signature-based detection. I give you the breakdown. I didn't talk about polymorphism. I know if you take in programming classes like object-oriented classes, it touches on the same technique. So polymorphism is the term to use for changing your code structure. And this is what we said before, that if they change the nature of the code, the structure of the code, that's considered polymorphism. And we use this in development for sure. Okay. And then when you pack software, that is just a way that we would set it up so that way it can be executable. It can be used to transfer, right? Compression in software and encrypting the code is used in development, but at the same time, it can be used for attacks. And then the next section, which is what we just covered, right? Changing routes, manipulating the traffic. So you can find that on page 2 of your notes. Now, the next section, we're going to talk about firewall. So I want to take this opportunity because some of you have not taken CIS-27. So when you take that class, you have a better understanding of firewall. When I used to teach upper level classes for the bachelor degree in a lot of schools, they have a whole course on firewall, right? On configuring different types of firewall, using different appliances, and so on. Cal State San Bernardino doesn't necessarily have that, but I've taught at private university that's really geared for like cybersecurity programs and things like that. So this can be a whole course, right? Linux can be a whole course, as you know. And so what you see is, so I want to take this opportunity to really dissect and tell you the basics so that way you know, right? Because some of you will be, right, security engineer or firewall engineer. We're going to have a certificate that's going to be firewall, and we can't call it engineer because it's higher level in the education, but it's going to focus on firewall configuration and management. Because if you're looking at the salary for firewall engineers, they start at like 94, 99 and up, and you can go all the way up to 200, $300,000. If you're looking at like some of the companies that make firewall, they dedicate 2 live engineers per client. So you have to do this live sometimes and to be able to manage it so that way it can protect the network, especially data centers and things like that. So a firewall, it can be a hardware appliance or a software appliance. On the business scale, you can get a security appliance that does all the things, right? IDS, IPS, and firewall. You can buy Cisco appliance, right? You can get Palo Alto, which is very pricey. So when we're looking at security appliance, on average, right, the cheapest one for small size business is going to be like 1,000 at least, or a couple $1,000s, and it can go up to $70,000 or $100,000, right? Depending on the level of firewall that you're using, the features that it comes with. So a firewall is a screen, typically, right? It does do the blocking. So you see software and hardware based. So an appliance is a box that we buy, sometimes small, sometimes large, and it has processor, RAM, right? Ports that are connecting to it. On a regular appliance, like if you're looking at Cisco firewall, you put it on the rack and you attach it to, your routers or your switches. So you have internal firewalls and external firewall. Remember, they're like security guards, right? So what you see is that it would examine the traffic like the IDS, but it also look at access control and the rules, and it's going to block, it's going to screen, depending on the type of firewall, like I said, for the level. Okay, so it looks at the packets like your IDS, what we talked about, but it's going to allow or deny. So if I set up a list of things that I allow, typically we call that a whitelist, right? Like I allow these IP addresses, then it's going to open the door and let that traffic in. But anything outside of that, it's going to reject, right? We can set up ports, we can set up protocols, we can set up IP addresses, and you see this with Windows Firewall, which is a host-based firewall, right? It comes equipped with your OS. So it looks at packet headers, right? So let's break down some of the network firewalls. So you have packet filtering firewall. These firewalls, their job is to look at packets, right? Typically, you install this with the routers. So it's in line with the router. So if you have 100 routers, you are going to have multiple firewalls to be able to screen the traffic. So the router, it's like the freeway taking you to the exit, right? You're going to have a lot of cars going into the exit, but putting that firewall there is like putting the police officer at the exit to look at every single car that's coming to that exit, right? So what you do is you add that with your routers, right? It's on the same rack, you attach it, and it's going to look at all the packets that's being routed, that's bringing to that exit from the freeway. So it's going to look at IP addresses, right? The packet type, which is your packet header. It looks at the port number, which is the doors and windows for your system to communicate. And so it basically interrogate the packets. Now, the challenge with this is, when I looked at like final project for a lot of the bachelor students, they're going to throw in a bunch of firewalls. And I'm going to tell them, if you have a lot of screens, what's going to happen is it's going to bottleneck right there. It's like if I put 5 police officers at the exit and they're going to look at each car slowly, you are going to have traffic congestion for sure, right? When we say bottleneck is when you get traffic congestion. So you have to kind of separate that, right? You can create right? Multiple exits, and we would place the screener at those multiple exits so our traffic can be prioritized so we can do quality of service. Okay? So it gives you the basic inspection for threats. Okay, so it would look something like this. Now, so you have an exterior router. This is routing to the external network and routing into your network, right? You're going to have a router or multiple routers. So if they're connecting to your network, right, and they're using spoofing technique to get into your network, you would need to screen the traffic, right, coming in and also leaving because they have to receive traffic back, right? They have to receive responses. So typically you have external firewall that's connecting to your external router, and then also internal firewall and screen for the inside. Just like how you have an IDS. All right, so let's answer some question. So how is a packet filtering firewall used in a network? How does it filter malicious traffic? How can packet filter firewall be evaded by the attacker? I'm gonna move 8 down if you're still working on that, so I can be on the next page. Okay. So for the packet filtering firewall, we want to place it between the exterior router and the interior router. Why do I need to have an interior router? Well, typically in a regular enterprise network, you're going to have the external router to take you, from your network to the next network, right? Like your service provider, and then also bring that traffic back into your network. Inside the internal network, you have an interior router to route in separate isolated segment or segregated segment. So for example, I might have a segment that is for my all my file servers, right? Or different departments, right? You might have a HR department that's on a different part of the network, right? Just like here, when you're looking at the college, your computer classrooms and lab is on a separate segment compared to the staff, right? And it has to route from the staff area into the student area. We do that to control access and also screen network activity. So that means that it needs to inspect, right, source and destination addresses, where it's coming from, where it's going to, the type of communication with the packet. So it looks at the packet header, it looks at the content, it looks at ports, protocols, and based on that, it's going to check against the rules that are set on that system. So let's say that I'm looking at port 80, right? There's web traffic using HTTP, but on my network, I don't use that port, right? Everything is going to be secure. So it's either uses 443, 444, or a different port number. So it's going to block that traffic, okay? Or if I don't allow ping, right? Ping uses ICMP and it does echo and request, and we talked about like Smurf attack previously. So it's going to look for port and protocols related to that. Why do administrators block ping? Because you don't want to get pinged to that, right? Or sometimes that might not be the service. So internally, I might allow ping on some segment for IT configuration, and then I would take away that service or disable that service in other areas, right? So if they spoof the packets, or if they build the packets that looks like your normal packets for communication, then by changing the payload information, by making the IP addresses acceptable in with your system and your network, then they would be able to bypass your firewall. And typically for a lot of external attackers coming in, right? If they hit that firewall, in order to evade, they have to typically do this. They have to change the packet information to get your firewall to allow that traffic coming in. Because the firewall, when it inspects it, it's going to say, nope, doesn't match what the rules I have, drop, like reject, stop, right? So they will not be successful coming into the network. And when you hear a lot of these attacks happening in the larger networks, right? This is why, right? They're able to bypass a lot of the security appliances. So when you filter packet, there are two areas. One is dynamic and the other one is static. Okay. Dynamic packet filtering firewall is used to handle protocols that are being transferred, right? That are using dynamic ports. So dynamic ports can be like this. Let's say that you have 4 doors to your house, right? You can receive shipment, package, or people in any door, right? So basically we use a range of ports to tell the system that any of these is allowable, and it can change time to time, right? One time you might receive your package at your front door, and other time you might receive your package on your side door, right? So dynamic ports work like that. We would control it by a range, but it would be a group of ports that we allow. And the way that we do this is for the efficiency in communication, right? You're saying, okay, why not just like allow one door? Yeah, there are certain things that we only allow one door, but you have to know that your system is going to receive and send a lot of different things, right? And you want responses, you in the request and so on. So what you have is you have a range of port, and this is considered dynamic. So dynamic filtering firewall, it would then look at the protocols and those ports for the application needs, right? And inspect it. Whereas static packet filtering firewall is then what you see is it's going to be specific to that point of communication and that pattern. Okay. So this is used in the smaller networks. Okay. The static one, where dynamic is for larger networks that uses a range of ports. Like I said, it's like maybe a bigger mansion that has many doors and windows. That will be dynamic because people can come and go at any door, right? Whereas static packet filtering firewall will be one door, one port, one address, and that's typically for the networks. So if you use this in a larger network, what happens is when you use static packet filtering firewall, you're going to have congestion because you're just having too many services and different protocols that's used, and it might not be able to inspect all the things that you want it to do. Question? So now we're going to go into a third type of packet filtering firewall. So many things to remember, right? So stateful packet filtering firewall compared to stateless, right? I emphasize a lot that a lot of our systems is state-based system, but we also created systems that are stateless, right? So your stateful packet filtering firewall, it looks at logs and connection information to determine the state of connectivity. Because your system communicate in signals, right? When you're looking at that, so when we receive signals across the wire, let's say copper, fiber optics, whatever it is, right? So it's looking at if there are active connections, then it's part of that connection state. So that's stateful. And based on that, it's going to look at malicious traffic pattern and say, is that matching the pattern of irregular traffic, right? So it's comparing the state of your connection is the stateful packet firewall. Whereas the stateless, it doesn't use the pattern for the malicious traffic. So in the case where you're using stateless packet filtering firewall, it cannot see that pattern if you have an attack that's happening. Okay. So because it doesn't check the historical information of your packets and it doesn't predict the future connections in your networks. So when I say future connection is based on the state that is established, right? There's assumption in things that are coming back, things that could be sent, and so on. Activities that's on your network. Any question? So now you can see there's state based on connection state, right? Activities that was happening with that connection compared to stateless, right? It doesn't have that information for communication. All right. So I also listed like disadvantages of using certain type of firewall. We don't have 100% in solutions, right? Sometimes you would see that different types of firewall being used for different objectives, and sometimes you would combine different types of firewall so that way you can have specific things addressed for security needs. We talked about this. So the static, here's the stateless information. You can find that on page 4 and onward. So for the stateless, it tells you here that it relies on the rules of the access, right? It does have faster response compared to the stateful. That's the reason why that it's chosen. And whereas your stateful, it looks at the packets once it identifies, so it's inspect that packets, and then based on the established connection. So it does give you a better or a higher level of security. So if you compare stateful to stateless, stateful gives you a little bit better inspection in the packet. All right, the next part, it goes over proxy firewall. A lot of people in the industry use proxy to screen, right? I'm going to give you a simple example. I guarantee that when you work in school district networks, you're going to see proxy being used to do like kind of like parental control, right? They use it to allow and disallow like websites that the kids access, because by regulation, anybody that's under 17, if you're offering network services to them, you gotta make sure that you block contents that are, that relates to nudity, gambling, potentially, hurting the students or not. Giving them a healthy access environment, right? So what you see is that they typically use proxy to screen. And so a proxy firewall is a way that we can set up connection between untrusted and trusted. We would be able to gatekeep what is the allowable services from coming from the internet. Okay. So what it does is it intercepts information, inquiries, requests, right? And it evaluates that. So it is still a screening system, but instead of looking at the packets, it's actually looking at the services and the requests for those services. Okay, like web, right? Like I talk about school district web, it looks at like the web requests between the students and the web server. So if they block YouTube, right, it's the students are going to try to access YouTube web server. So it's going to look at that request. It's going to say reject. And so it would just show access denied on their screen. Okay. And so in the response, typically you would see that they would set up requester with the relays. So that way you are not going to have bottleneck or control only with specific proxy. Companies use many proxies. Proxies can be used to prioritize traffic, and it can also use to screen traffic. The way I look at it is like the police officer that tells you to detour when there's accident, right? So you can treat it that way. So proxy works with the application layer, and this is what you typically see with web is with the browser. You can specify the type of application that you want for that to work. So it's configured, right, to inspect the traffic. Or I'm sorry, not the traffic, the requests, which is also services related traffic. So typically you see regular firewall and you see proxies being implemented in an infrastructure. It also, it is responding a little bit better in resources like as a screening tool. Okay. And you can block some web threats with that. Okay, so with that, we can answer 12. So in comparison to packet firewall, why is proxy firewall more secure in filtering application-based activity? And in what type of network environment should you use proxy firewall? So proxy firewall looks at content, right? Example, web content, right? So outside of, we talked about like packet filtering, it does look at the payload, but it's looking at application level content, okay? Like your browser needs HTML to be able to give you web content, web pages, okay? And if you incorporate authentication for your internal network, and you can control that for access purposes. So it tells you here that along with incorporating user authentication and anonymizing internal network, the user access information, you can control content filtering using proxy. Like, for example, I want to be able to not allow, right, grade school students to obtain specific content that is related to nudity, sex, maybe cyber risk-based activity, and so on, right? So I can use proxy firewall for that. Packet filtering does not do well with this is because packet filtering only looking at who's sending, who's receiving, and services information. So we want to look more specifically on content that's being received and sent. So you have the students, they have to request that kind of content. And so that way it's the server's going to then respond, right? So we want to be able to incorporate this in more of like a complex enterprise environment to control data exchange and paramount. But this is a generalized answer. I think in most networks you're gonna see proxy firewall to manage access for content. So if you're thinking about let's say if they're downloading, right? If a kid, right, wants to download maybe nudity content, okay? What happens is that request is going to come through, right, in chunks, in content. right? Because image or video is then it's going to send that through. And when each of the pieces of that content is then going to be inspected and it's going to drop it. Okay. If you use packet filtering, you can do some of the prevention with it, but you're going to have to specify like which server is giving them that. And then the payload size, sometimes it can't inspect that too well. Whereas if you're looking at like videos that they're receiving or downloading, it's really looking at the video content, and that comes through from the request that they submit. So I hope that you can see the difference in that. Okay. And then for 13, it asks you what type of proxy firewall is used in front of one or more web servers, right? Intercepting requests from the internet, load balance, or have you increase in web requests, which is what we call web acceleration. You can use reverse proxy firewall. So in the past lab, you have used ZAP before, I believe, right? Z attack on proxy. And this is what you see is Z attack on proxy plays on reverse proxy. It is an interception point. So it's kind of like I can place somebody, right, on the road or at the exit to really, pass the information to me, right? Instead of allowing it through, it basically receives that and then passes. It's the middleman. Okay. So reverse proxy does that. It's gonna intercept the traffic, and then you can regulate it where this type of traffic goes here, turn right. This type of traffic turns left. This type of traffic goes straight. And this is what we do for web balancing and acceleration. You can set up relay systems or forwarding systems to control, right? Like so for example, if I have e-commerce website, if I want to load balance and accelerate, I can say that, oh, if for the customer who's not logged in and just looking at my website to browse around for products, right, send it to this side, right? Make them turn left. Whereas the customers that are logging in and adding things to their cart and going through checkout go straight, right? We would set up a reverse proxy to regulate that traffic and then send that through, so that way we have assured, right, purchases. Whereas if they are doing other things on the e-commerce website, then go right. So you can set it up to regulate traffic, and then also but it's still gonna have to intercept. Okay. Question? So it screens and send the traffic in specific ways that you want. Okay. And then go through and read the notes to talk about like advantages and disadvantages of using proxy. So I want to point out that proxy servers save data into the RAM. So it caches that, and if they can have access to it, it does expose the information. System has to, in order to, because it is a middle point, right? It's kind of like, I want to tell Elena a secret. And so, but I have to go through another person, right? So I have to tell that secret to that person, and that person is going to relay that information. So that person has to save the information, right? So your proxy server, it caches the data, and if it's sensitive data, right, that can be vulnerable if they have access to it. So, because we're screening it through that particular system because it stores it. So if you use it, you can use end-to-end encryption. Like Elena has to encrypt and I have to encrypt. So when we pass the information, it's encrypted, so it's protected. So that's a way that you can do that. Here it talks about forwarding proxy, reverse proxy, and transparent proxy. I think in your assignments, I only emphasize this, right? The forward proxy, you can use this to go from, your networks into the larger networks or the internet, but it does cache the functions when it filters, right? Where reverse proxy, it intercept the request and then send those requests to the internet. And then transparent proxy, it also does the interception. It's also named as force proxy or inline proxy. It does intercept the communication, but it's focused more on the routing aspect where it does the network layer to send from and to. And then you have anonymous proxy and non-transparent proxy. So these are the type of proxy can be used, right? So you can perform, the attacker, when they do the non-transparent, so the proxy is visible to the user, right? And we can content filter with the non-transparent, but it would perform a task using IP masking, which is another way that we can set up the IP. So you need to configure this. Like what you see with, how you anonymously browsing, that's kind of like the non-transparent proxy. And then you have anonymous proxy. It hides your IP address. So when you see this on Chrome or Firefox, your browser, it utilizes these mechanisms, right? And then they have distorting proxy and elite proxy. So if you don't use forwarder for HTTP, it doesn't send it as a forwarding header. It's harder to really see where that's going to, so it hides that. And it's harder to detect. So from a defensive side, right, if you're using this, they won't be able to know like your traffic where that's going to, especially for web. But if the attacker uses this, right, you won't be able to see, where they're forwarding their stuff to if they're redirecting. And then distorting proxy, it's like confusing the system using incorrect IP addresses. So for web services, by hiding it or masking it or changing it. So it is a way to, navigate it without giving the correct information. Any question regarding proxy? Okay, so what type of proxy firewalls can be used to maintain IP privacy? So if you don't want your IP to be exposed, you can set up non-transparent proxy, anonymous proxy, or distorting proxy. I just talked about that, right? It doesn't make your IP, especially the destination IP, be visible. So you can make incorrect information like using an IP address that's not really correlate to that, right? Or hiding it. So that way you don't expose your IP information. Now, we talked about stateful and stateless packet filtering firewall. Now we're going to look at stateful inspection firewall. Different thing. They're kind of similar in term, but this one is the inspection firewall for state. So stateful inspection firewall, they're different from packet filtering firewall in that it looks at your network resources. And in the case that if you have attacks, right, which is an exploitation on your vulnerability, it's already been establishing connection, it's able to block it. So the packet filtering firewall, it's only looking at packet in connection, especially when we're looking at dynamic ports and IP addresses, right? But the stateful inspection firewall, it's looking at already established connection And in the case that if they're already connected to the critical system and they're launching the attack, right? Like let's say they run Metasploit or something like that, then it's going to see it and block it. So this is the next level after you inspect, right, what's allowed into your network and what's disallowed. Let's say that they bypass that and they got into your network and they're connected to your critical systems, right? And they're launching the attack with that. Hopefully, right, your stateful inspection firewall has effective rule to look at exploitation, which is codes that's being launched, right? And then drop that. So it looks at the state, right, which is already established with connection and potential activities that's happening for that state. Now, another thing that you also learn in when you're reading the notes is it talks about circuit level gateways. In the past, I had you configure gateway with router IP address, right? That's your default gateway. Typically, gateway is the system that brings you to another system or the rest of your network in the case of a default gateway. So a circuit level gateway, this one doesn't inspect packets like your packet filtering firewall. Their job is to make sure that your sessions are legitimate, are trusted, and your packets are part of the connection by looking at your session state. Okay. So that means that you have to already been connected to establish a session. We talked about like session hijack in the past. So when you're looking at that from a perspective of like a web session, you have a session ID, right? You already connected to your servers. You already send some kind of inquiry to that server. Whereas packet filtering firewall, it looks at the packet being sent for connection purposes, right? So it's already known connection, and it looks at the communication for the session in those connections. Okay, so if you go into the industry now, right, you are going to see next generation firewall for sure. A lot of companies use this because we have different needs and we want to be able to accommodate without having to narrow down to only packets, right? Only stateful inspection. So next generation firewall came out. It is different than your traditional firewalls like stateful inspection or packet filtering firewall in that it does some tasks like the packet filter and it does some tasks as a stateful. So this is the next elevated level. So your NGFW, typically they're known as next generation firewall like this, right? With the acronyms. It looks at the payload packets, which is what you see in packet filtering task, right? It uses threat intelligence. So it has signature behavior and threat lists for identification. It looks at the application flow and the data that goes with it, which is part of payload, right? So that means that it has features from both packet and stateful inspection, along with deep inspection, deep packet inspection, your DPI, to look at your data in the packet. So earlier we talked about like proxy doing better with the content, right? So we have to come up with a box that does multiple things that also look at the content without using proxy, and that's your next generation firewall. Okay. So that means that in an OSI layer, it looks at your frame, your packet to the layer 3, right? Your transport and all the other layers all the way to the application layer in the OSI, right? So you know that next generation firewall is more expensive because of the feature. So like I said, you get a Palo Alto that does this, right? That is intuitive, that has a lot of other things outside of what you pay as a service for live engineers, gonna run you $70,000 or more, right? Security appliances are very pricey. So we don't just rip down security appliance and replace it that quickly. You kind of, as an analyst, I tell my other class, you kind of have to see, right, the need in your benchmark for your security and your network with the current appliances, and you see the gap. Like, should we upgrade to this, right? Right now, we might have like stateful inspection, proxy, and also your packet filter, which is very common in a lot of networks, right? Should we go and spend a bunch of money and get next generation firewall? Typically on the business side, they don't want, and when you do that, you have to kind of tear down different parts of your critical network. So you have to integrate things slowly, right? And so what you see is that this is like more kind of like an all-in-one appliance, but you have to see if that's needed, because some in small networks sometimes it's not necessary. So you typically see this in an enterprise network, and they have many, right? So one thing, like if you enjoy like customer service and sales, and if you want to do security with it, IT security sales is good, right? Commission is really good. You can work for like big companies like Cisco, Palo Alto, but you have to know like what these things do, and you also have to have certification in some area in order to sell to, your directors and your CISO and the security team. So okay, so here it talks about stateful inspection firewall. So you have things like state table. So this is like the things that it checks against, right? Equipment comes with your default state table. You can also configure it. And then it utilized the inspection engine to look at the table to see the anomaly. So it talks about like dynamic state table where you would have active connections and you can track the session. Um, so as an engineer, what you see is that you have to maintain the state table and you want to be able to make sure that your session is monitored, right? So that way you can prevent unwanted traffic. So the sequence for inspection, when you're looking at like TCP protocols, because it's three-way handshake like HTTP, your state would be open. That means that when it's first start communication, once there's agreement for exchange of information, that's your connection is established. And then once the user have that get, right, like it's already served that HTML file, then when you have that fin act, as soon as that packets come through, you're gonna see that the stateful inspection is gonna have a closed state. So that's how it's going to check based on these three states. It's different than the packet filter, whereas the packet filter really relies on like information on the packet header. So it when you have the packet headers coming through, it uses a flag or multiple flags to indicate the state. And then it tells you that this can be also used to control content based on established connection. And I suggest this, right? So if you maintain your state table, if you adjust the filtering based on, the need of your network, uh, the connection, how it's established, how it ends, you can have more response in security protection. Um, and we can automate some of this, but now I think a lot of the equipment also come with like AI feature and things like that. Okay. And then it talks about disadvantages. So circuit level gateway is on the bottom of page 10 going to 11. And then your next generation firewall is 11. To be honest with you, I think like outside of packet tracer, which is only for Cisco devices, you don't really have a good simulator. I did see during COVID, I was trying to teach security classes online only, and I did use some of the more modern brand simulator for configuration purposes. So it shows you like how you can go in and configure some of these things. But there is not a lot. So if you really want to get into this area, I highly recommend, let's say that you get a job in IT, you ask the people that does security to get you to work on these things. A lot of them, they have graphical user interface now or command line interface where you can learn. If you use Cisco devices, right, a lot of the commands are the same. So you would configure, right, your stateful table where you can go in and add in the rules and changing it. That's how you're going to get better. So if you apply to work for Palo Alto because you have some experience in firewall, they're going to train you on their product for sure because they have, different interfaces and different features in some of their appliances. But there's a lot of need for this area. It's funny because when I look at jobs, right, I look at the overall jobs. A lot of these jobs are remote. I have a friend that works 100% remote from home, and he's a firewall engineer, um, making well over 200, right, for some company. But then when I go back to the region and ask them if I can make a certificate in this, and they would say, oh, well, there's not a lot of jobs in Inland Empire based on this. No, duh, because a lot of the companies hire remotely for these type of work, right? You do have a high percentage of remote work, but sometimes they are hybrid, right? Even though you work remotely, they're gonna have to bring you in occasionally for that. So, but you do see, right, a lot of these things. So I hope that like this session gives you a better understanding of, which firewall is which and how it works. And that's going to help. Even if you become a network engineer, you are going to have to work with these appliances to be placed into your network, like which one goes where, right? So, all right. So host-based firewall is like that you would install on your system. Windows firewall is a good example for that. Okay. So, all right. Describe the drawback of cloud-based firewall solution. So, if you're using cloud-based firewall solution, it is a remote firewall that you are accessing, right? Many companies use this actually, not just for their cloud systems, but let's say that I have internal network appliances, but I don't want to spend so much money on next generation firewall. I want to rent it, right? So cloud-based system is like rental system. I want to use AWS firewalls that they already have installed, and I just want to pay a monthly fee on top of that, or based on what I need, like using elasticity. So you are gonna need to have a contract with your provider, right? Like Amazon or Microsoft or whoever, Palo Alto, right? Cisco. Um, and you are going to need to have authorization. They typically give you access to configure your firewall, and they do the hardware maintenance, right? Making sure it has power, it has enough resources, the hardware part, and then also a little bit on their iOS or the operating system. Now, if they don't maintain the security as much as is required, then you are at risk in that, right? So it's really, you have to look at your contract because at the end of the day, in the case that they bypass the firewall that you're using and they get into your network and there's data leak or there's a breach, you are liable for that breach, not them, right? There might be some percentage that they might be liable if they're a little bit on their part, and then they're gonna push back on like security insurance or cybersecurity insurance that you have, right? So sometimes they don't let you rent the cloud firewall unless you have security insurance. It's like you can't rent a car without having a driver license and your own insurance. If not, like you have to buy their insurance, right? So typically it's that. So you are going to rely on some part on their side, and then you are going to, so you might not be able to customize as much because it's really to the hardware that you're getting. So even if you get the next generation firewall, they're going to tell you that, oh, you can only modify these things, right? And then you have to make sure that you pay an annual fee, a monthly fee, or as much as you use it, and they can control the cost in that. So in an enterprise network, if we are renting our firewalls, they're gonna say, oh, because of the traffic and the activities and the application that you use, this is the cost that we're gonna charge. So it might not be just a base rate for everybody. Okay, so it's fair. But this is also a solution that you see. I knew a few of my clients actually use this because they don't want to have a lot of management internally because they just don't have the people to do that. So on top of that, they pay for a service for engineers to be able to do that. So that means that like you have to pay the cost of your cloud systems and then also somebody that's managing it. So kind of like outsourcing almost, but they can still control some of it. So that's like, a little bit more than 50-50. I want to say like 60-40 or 70-30. But it depends on your subscription. Question? Okay. So as a pen tester, we come down to this. Now we know all the things that the firewalls do. We wanted to see like if an attacker evade the firewalls, we touch on like different areas already. How can they do that? And then if you're a pen tester, you're gonna hit the firewall. Typically, as soon as you get routed in or inside, right, you have to find ways. So a lot of the time, blind testing really means that you're hired to access different parts of the network, not knowing what everything is, right? So you kind of have to scan and look for things. And then when you get to it, you have to find ways around it. So to evade, typically you would see encrypted traffic, which is VPN. VPN would secure your connection by not exposing your connection information between the devices and the systems. And also masking the IP addresses to be able to be allowed, right? It's like I'm coming to your house and I'm a stranger. Masking an IP is like I identify myself as your family member so I can get into your house. So it needs to be an IP address that's on the allowed list, right? To get, so you know how when you configure your labs in the past, I have to do the 192.168.25.11 and 12. Basically, you're already inside that network with the IP address. So if you don't have the IP address, you gotta make sure that your system has the IP address that is on that segment or that network so that way you can access that network, right? It's a really simple concept. You can't access anything unless it is identified as allowed and it is that's part of the network. They can also use proxy to hide the original IP address. Remember we talked about non-transparent, anonymous, right? Those type of proxy keeps the IP address private, so that way it is not screened by the firewall. So tunneling is also part of VPN. It is a way that we cover up or we encapsulate activity, our network traffic. So to do that, typically you see this with IPsec, that's part of VPN. So we can encapsulate the data packet and our network traffic, right, by using protocols like IPsec, which is typically you have to set up a VPN for that. So when you're using VPN, your traffic is not exposed, right? So it indicates that if someone wants to see your traffic, it won't be able to disclose that information. If it's not disclosing that information, they won't be able to see it. VPN does that. So IPsec does tunneling encapsulation. And there are other protocols in VPN that don't always give you that same protection, because in encapsulation and tunneling, it adds a different header. So your header doesn't have the details that you typically have, right, with source and IP address and protocol information. So that's how we're able to encapsulate the packet and get it through. All right. It is a little longer today. I'm coming to 3 o'clock, so I'm going to try to wrap it up. All right. So the last part is on Honeypot. Honeypot it could be a server, a system that is used to lure or attract attackers, so that way you can understand the type of attacks that could be happening in your network. Typically, they put things that, like password files, fake sensitive information on there, things like that, like system settings that looks like it's exposed. When I did the lab with Shodan for my 41A class, right, I had them use Shodan to look at a lot of the web servers that are basically exposed, even cloud-based ones, right? So we see a lot of honeypots. Shodan tells you that it is honeypot. So you guys are gonna have Shodan later for another lab. But so honeypot tells you the communication of potential attacks. It is a way that we can learn about attack, and it really mimicked the real system. So they would set it up like a real web server. It looks like a real web server, and it has some content, so that way it attracts the attacker. Now, if they're using things like Shodan, the search engine is going to tell them, oh, potentially that's a honeypot. Do they really want to hit it? Sometimes they want to hit it to see, like, what kind of things you put on there, or how you connecting that to your other part of the network. You still have to host it. So from the outside coming in, typically you see web servers that look like a real web server, but it has fake information on there, right? So you would enable a bunch of services, right? Like I would put HTTPS on there. I would put a bunch of files. I would make like fake databases that doesn't really have sensitive information about my customer, but it does look like fake sensitive information. So the functionality is going to lure the attacker to exploit it. And you do that to understand and analyze potential attack activities, right? So that's considered a research honeypot. And so honeypots attempt to lure malicious servers, lure in malicious servers and attackers use while hacking clients. So you can also set up honeypots, right? In your network to identify your attacker. Let me see. What type of honeypots attempt to lure malicious attackers and say, so that way they can use while hacking clients, and how they're deployed on the network. So you can use things like client honeypots to lure to set up, I should say, to set up malicious servers to lure the attackers. And so that way, in the case that if they're attacking you, right, they would also see only the honeypot. It's typically a virtual machine or a virtual system. Right? So you can use cloud-based environment to set that up, right? Basically, cloud is just a remote server. You can spin up an instance, which is your virtual machines. So if you use AWS, you can use like EC2 for that. I can set up like a web server using Windows, like what you guys have done with IIS. And so the attacker would then pose as a client, right? You can, as a pen tester, you can pose as a client to observe how the attacker make modification in the attack. So they have to modify the packets. They have to modify IP information. They need to modify either the content. So there's many different form of attack. So in that case, right, we basically use a honeypot to really see their tactics for sure. So you see a lot of honeypots still, but my advice is if you're using honeypot, you just gotta make sure between your honeypot and your real network, how you secure it. Because a lot of time we still have to remotely connect it to it. We have to monitor it. We have to see what's going on, right? So ultimately, it is still a system that is connecting. You can segregate it. You can virtually segregate it. You can, but like VLAN and other things. But VLAN escape is also a way. So if they can get to it, and if it's connected to your network, they might get to your network. So just time and resources, right? And time is gonna give them knowledge. So of your network. Okay, so honeypot information. Here's cloud-based firewall. So it's considered FWaaS. And then honeypot deception is on page 14 and 16. So let's say that you're a pen tester and you get to the honeypot, right? You have to know that it is a honeypot. Okay. And then there's like different types of honeypots. So there's pure honeypot. So it looks like real servers. It mimic production system like authentication server, web server, file servers, and so on. It might contain sensitive information, like I said, like password, account, social security, but they're fake, right? You can also have high interaction honeypot where you can make it to get the attacker to stay on it as long as possible. So they would invest more interaction to your honeypot. Okay. So that way you can see potentially what they're doing. So they're going to try to look for vulnerabilities. So they're going to run scans and things like that. So you can see the tools they're using. And then there's mid-interaction honeypot, which is a little less. So typically they don't have OSs, right? You can have it as just application or run a function, something like that. There's also low interaction honeypot, less resources, very little content on that one. So if I build a honeypot, typically it would be this, right? You want to gather information or pure honeypot. Because these things, I think it will be just a total waste of assets. And then you have malware honeypots, which uses attack vectors to lure in malware. So you do see a lot of malware attack where they drop malware. That means that they get into your networks or your system to be able to install malware. So if you set it up to be a system where they would install malware, that's a malware honeypot. malware comes in many different ways. And then you have spam honeypot to attract spammers. So it's a spam trap. There's database honeypot. So if you wanted to see what kind of SQL injection or code injection to obtain data, you set up a database and you lure them, right? But you can also use application firewall because database uses application or firewall for database to control that, right? So they're going to try to inject to get sensitive information. And then the client honeypot is on page 15. So that would lure the attackers. And so the client honeypot would then use as virtual system. So you can virtualize that. And then honey nets are just multiple honeypots connecting together. You do see that. This is mostly built to get information on distributed denial of service attack. And ransomware. But you can also use malware honeypot for ransomware. Not all companies invest in this, right? Like I said, it is also a system that you have to manage and maintain. So, all right, deception techniques is the last one, and we're gonna stop after this, right? So some of the common deception technique is misleading information, right? You can use false signal, you can use fake vulnerability on the honeypot, you can use fake or false credential, and honeypots itself is a deception. And you can also use honey tokens or honey files, right? Because tokens is typically tied to like things that can be exchanged and communicated and trust, right? And the same thing with honeypots. Now, the common open source one, I think some of you have seen this, right? Pentbox is probably the easiest package that you can do just to launch, to host or to start your honeypot. There are other ways. You can manually set it up like a regular system and then throw things on there that you think that would be attractive to the attacker. And then you can run monitoring tool to see their activity and then use the logs and parse the logs so that way you can see like the type of things that they're doing. But you have to be able to interpret that and analyze and interpret it. So on the research honeypot, that's what you would have. Any question? A lot of information today. Like I said, right? Like this unit alone can be a course. Just like how I teach encryption in CIS-27 or other classes, itself is a course in other type of institutions. So, because there's a lot of details. But if this interests you, you can dive a little deeper, read the notes, and then also research the information. I think that's also useful. But for this class and also for the nature of pen testing, you need to know what they are, what they do. So in the case where you come across them, you know how to be able to handle them, right? All right, so let's stop recording.